yeah. I mean, what I can do is like maybe go to Damasio, which
Yes,
is
please.
her like
Yeah. Yeah.
principal reference here. Uh, and Damasio is a wonderful. Like, I know I'm skeptical of him and things, but he is, of course, a very good thinker. Um, the basic argument is that like that what he calls in a very famous book Descartes' error, which is that which is to split not only like the mind-body dualism, but more specifically to assume that there's something like a like divine rationality, a kind of metaphysical mind that is the seat of rationality, and then the animalistic element of like emotions, of sensibility, of these things. Banging your leg against a table and like shouting out in pain. Uh, there's nothing like mind, like in relation to the mind here, is the kind of Cartesian argument. It's just a kind of mechanistic emotional reaction to a sense stimulus. Um, and what we have on the other hand, like on the other field, is rationality. Um, and the argument of Antonio Damasio is that this has been the tendency that not only like since Descartes, even though Descartes was overcome, modern science kind of revived and somehow unintentionally had a fidelity to this division between emotion and rationality. But what in almost like, and he doesn't admit it, but there's almost a Nietzschean logic to it. But Antonio Damasio's argument is that, in fact, I mean, the basic argument is that without emotion, rationality itself becomes impossible. That's the basic argument.
Can I
Like,
interrupt for a bit? When
mm,
you say rationality, at least within the context of this, is that also synonymous to reason? Because your Substack piece, it's reason against emotion. So when you mean
mm,
rationality, you also mean reason. Is
yes,
that
yes,
correct for me to
yes,
assume?
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Uh, yes, I mean, yeah, it is in this context. Yes, yeah, it's
In this
synonymous.
context, yes,
Yeah,
correct. I know
yeah,
there's a lot more to get into the
yeah, yeah,
concept
yeah.
of reason for
Um,
sure. Yeah.
but yes, yes. So the point is that if you don't have like emotional markers, you can't reason about information properly. And the argument is, for example, if you are going to engage in some type of like sophisticated social or external like maneuver, trying to figure out what to do, the best option, and you have to reason about it. You have to weigh up options, etc. Um, Damasio's argument is that here, if you lose emotion, like if you lose the capacity to register emotion, your own emotion, like not even the emotion, but like your own emotion, you then lose the what appeared as the opposed function, which is reason, cold, sober, logical calculation. You lose that as well. Um, and Damasio invents the famous somatic marker hypothesis, which because there's an interesting Nietzschean color to this, because Nietzsche makes this very strange argument in The Will to Power, like the collected notebooks, after the ones that were collected after his death, and then kind of for a period of time vulgarized by his sister, um, or made more fascistic by his sister. But he makes the argument there that there's always a question with Nietzsche's will to power: is it like a basic biological function, or is it is it an excessively human or superhuman capacity to dominate or to create beyond the boundaries of kind of preconceived forms, etc. Is it either like hyperhuman, or is it the basic ground for biology and nature? Um, but he makes this very strange argument where he says, no, the will to power begins with logic. The will to power begins with our capacity to make a logical equation between two things that would otherwise, like, you wouldn't think of a trade or an exchange beyond a certain will which imposes an equivalence between two things, whether it's that 3 of this commodity and 4 of that commodity are in fact worth about the same. Nietzsche's argument is that this drive to subjectively impose your own will, your own emotional experience onto things is where logic comes from. So there's this, ironically, Nietzschean color to Damasio, although I don't think he'd like hearing that. But so yes, this is where Catherine Malabou's use of neuroscience comes from. Like specifically, it's her reading of Damasio, and what she argues is that he's therefore Spinozan, because Spinoza was the first philosopher to recognize that the body is absolutely crucial in substance. Like the body, even in like his ethics, in the construction of an ethical ontological, Deleuze's famous argument that Spinoza is the first thinker in which ethics and ontology presuppose each other. They operate on the same field. Like an ontological system furnishes a set of ethical premises, and their premises perpetually refer back to their own. The ethical structures perpetually refer back to the ontological background or to the ontological ground. Either way, but the argument there as well is, what Catherine Malabou points out is that Spinoza recognized how important emotion, bodily experience, sensuality, all of these things are for higher order ethical functions. The body, vulgar, base, disgusting sensual experience is as much a part of substance as, the mind of God, essentially, So that's how she uses, that's where she sees, and you can tie this with Freud in 100 different ways. For Freud, the emotional experience, specifically the partial drives and partial cathexes, which manifest themselves in bodily forms, are also often translated into intellectual manifestations and things. But yes, that's her use of neuroscience to
Excellent.
make it short.
Since we're mentioning a few names, you can also ask. I mean, I think you've written on Merleau-Ponty too, and certainly I've read essays by Malabou on Merleau-Ponty, on phantom limbs and whatnot. She has a great essay which I read recently. But can I ask, just since we're talking about historical figures, where would someone like Merleau-Ponty with his notion of the body come into this equation, this discussion?
Well, I think there's in a slightly orthogonal way, in an awkward way, in fact, because initially you think, Merleau-Ponty's basic contribution was to include the body, the experience of the body within those forms of phenomenological experience, even the forms of phenomenological ontology of Sartre. But what Merleau-Ponty does, which is what I wrote in one of the critiques of Antonio Damasio, which is that, so returning to Damasio, what happens is you have an emotional ground to reason, let's say. Reason emerges because it can assimilate emotion. And if you lose emotion, you lose reason itself. But there's a fantastic portion in the phenomenology of perception. By Merleau-Ponty, where he argues that, he says, imagine you're watching a film that's been dubbed. So let's say it was recorded in German and you're watching it in French or English. And he says that what starts happening is that you're not then grateful to be hearing it in your language or in your mother tongue. What you start listening for are weird, the gaps between, let's say, where the mouth is still moving because they'd be speaking in German, but the voice cuts out because the dub is in English. And you watch for the bits of non-information, and it totally reworks the film. And all you're listening for example, is the moments where the dub and the video, the audio and the video, simply stop working all of a sudden. And your experience of the film fundamentally changes. It's like the what in the film could be intended to be the most romantic gesture of a renunciation or sacrifice, or a kind of cruel, cathartic attack, whatever. Suddenly, it doesn't have that emotional token at all anymore. Suddenly, what you're watching for is what's missed in the scene, or suddenly, because you're simply hyperfixating on the bad quality of the dub, uh, what you're experiencing directly counters the emotional framework of the film. You know, in the original German, all of the moviegoers might have cried when the main character proposes. You know, they might have been, you know, overwhelmed with this kind of like sympathetic emotion. But let's say in the dub, you know, he carries on, his mouth carries on moving in the German, but the English stops speaking. You know, suddenly it seems pathetic, it seems ridiculous, and you're having a totally. And my argument is that in relation to this, you know, take something like disappointment, or loss, or failure, or joy, euphoria. These emotions are very, very different things for a Stoic, or for a Nietzschean, or for a whatever, an anarchist, or for a kind of Schopenhauerian pessimist. These emotional experiences are very different. So my argument is that, in fact, with Merleau-Ponty, yes, you can argue that emotion contributes to reason, of course, but the extension. I mean, my argument is that reason also retroactively affects emotion. Like once, like rational frameworks and systems and rational conclusions themselves will reformulate the emotional premise in which they emerge. In the same way that in the same way that if I have reasoned my way into a kind of into a position of nihilism or kind of naive spiritual optimism, then the news that my dog has passed away will be registered very differently. Even the emotional experience will be a different experience, and this is my argument that he does the right thing, Damasio and Malibu, by entertaining um, this split between rationality and emotion needs to be undone. Emotion contributes to rationality. If you lose emotional processing, you, by extension, lose the ability to reason. But my argument is that it needs to be taken much further than that. And what the important argument is that reason itself affects emotion, not just emotion affects reason. It's a two-way street. And once you hit a period, this is also where I see one of my big problems with neuropsychoanalysis, which is that it's clear that at a certain point, like mind itself becomes infinitely beyond biology, beyond brain, and you like what's important is recognizing the retroaction of certain things upon other things. For example, and John Dall'Aglio, I'll pronounce it terribly, but John Dall'Aglio points this out, which is that yes, we all have something like a hippocampus. So I'm going off target now, but this is like, I'll go back to the thing. Like we all have something
No,
like
please keep going. I had a question on neuropsychoanalysis
yes,
anyway, so this would in fact be a segue. So keep going.
yes. No, but we all have like a hippocampus, which allows kind of rudimentary information and memories to be stored. But humans have a neocortex. Like we have an advanced external brain layer, etc. But the weird paradox is that it's not that like rudimentary memories are then slowly moved out and processed more effectively and more in a more rich way by the neocortex. No, it's that the neocortex has a kind of top down, it can reconstruct more primitive functions. And once you reach the higher modes of cortical rational human processing, they have a retroactive effect on the more basic memory structures, on the more basic primitive forms. And this, I mean, this conclusion part, I don't think they take it because this is also where where Lacan becomes extremely important. But even Hegel is clear here, and this isn't a big insight, but for Hegel, like the most important aspect of his logic, and even of his his phenomenology, is that a singular instance revises, it reconstructs the whole or the universal to which it belongs. It begins with the moment substance appears as subject, substance itself is no longer the same thing. The moment for example, the moment an idea, an aesthetic idea, appears in this concrete form, it is no longer the same aesthetic idea. In fact, the very notion, the basic coordinates of an aesthetic idea is retroactively reworked by its particular expression. And if there's one thing here, it's like this, what's called this top-down processing, where the basic evolutionarily older primitive forms of processing, the moment you achieve this higher self-conscious neocortical structure, they have to be like the basic forms of memory processing, the more primitive structures themselves are retroactively forced to adapt to it. And this is a very different so anyway, yeah, I mean, we can go into that more because
yeah, I mean, it's so beautifully put. And I should mention here, so the way you conclude this piece, this critique of Damasio, is you say here, and again, this is apropos this, the sensible dichotomy between emotion and reason. You say emotion is a condition of reason that is in turn altered by this very achievement. And so I think that in a very, at the end of the day, these arguments you can't capture in like a cogent, like one pithy sense. But this, for me, that conclusion's perfect. It's a perfect way to conclude that piece. And